Hello everyone, this is episode 3 in our series on difficult verses in the Bible. Today we are going to explore one of the most debated verses in the Old Testament, 2 Samuel chapter 24 verse 1. This is the passage where it says that God prompted David to count the people of Israel, yet when David did so, God punished him. At first glance, this raises a challenging question. Why would God prompt David to do something and then call it a sin? How can an action be both divinely permitted and sinful at the same time? To answer this, we need to look carefully at the context, the text, and the theological principles underlying this episode. Let us begin by reading the verse. 2 Samuel chapter 24 verse 1. Again, the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he incited David against them, saying, Go, number the people of Israel and Judah. What we first notice is God's anger against Israel. 2 Samuel chapter 24 begins with a statement that God's anger was already kindled against Israel. This is important because it shows that the census was not the original cause of God's anger. Israel had already sinned and their disobedience had provoked God's judgment. And the census was simply the instrument through which that judgment was carried out. The verse continues by saying that God incited David against them to conduct the census. Now, this does not mean God forced David to sin. Rather, it means God allowed David to follow the pride that was already present in his heart. So, the responsibility for the act remained with David. Think of it like this: Israel's sin stirred God's anger, David's pride triggered the method of judgment, and the census was a tool God used to discipline his people. So the census itself was not inherently sinful, it became sinful because of the heart behind it and the larger context of divine judgment. Secondly, we need to consider the two accounts of the same event. Interestingly, this story is recorded in two places in the Old Testament. 2 Samuel chapter 24 verse 1 and 1 Chronicles chapter 21 verse 1. These two accounts describe the same event from different perspectives. 2 Samuel chapter 24 says God moved David to number Israel. 1 Chronicles 21 says Satan stood up against Israel and incited David to number Israel. In 2 Samuel, it was God who moved David to number Israel, but in 1 Chronicles, it was Satan who incited David to number Israel. Now, this difference highlights two important aspects. One, divine authority, and two, human responsibility. The writer of Samuel emphasizes God's ultimate control. For him, nothing happens outside of God's will, and so he emphasizes God's action in moving David. But the writer of Chronicles emphasizes human responsibility and spiritual hostility, showing that Satan played a role in tempting David. So, in essence, Satan was the immediate cause, but God allowed the situation to accomplish his larger purpose. The Hebrew word Satan simply means adversary, and in some cases, it could refer to a human mastermind as well. So, Satan here could refer to a human person, maybe a counselor or official who prompted David to act foolishly. So, the two accounts are not contradictory, they highlight different dimensions of the same event: God's authority, Satan's instigation, and David's responsibility. So, God's authority and human responsibility work together. God may allow Satan to tempt, but humans still make their own choices and are responsible for them. So, did God cause David to sin? The answer is no. As James chapter 1 verse 13 reminds us, God does not tempt anyone to sin, but he sometimes permits testing or allows people to act according to their sinful desires as part of his greater purpose. In this case, God allowed Satan to tempt David. David had a choice and he chose pride over trust. That is why he was held accountable. So while God permitted the census, David was fully accountable for his choice. Thirdly, why was the census sinful? Counting people in itself was not sinful. In fact, the law of Moses permitted census, but only when conducted according to God's instructions. In Exodus chapter 30, verses 11 to 16, God gave clear guidelines. 1. A census has to be commanded by God. 2. The Levites were to be excluded. And 3. Each person counted was required to pay a ransom offering, a half shekel as an atonement. However, David ignored all of these guidelines. He did not collect the atonement offering. He did not exclude the Levites. Above all, God did not command this census, and it was driven by pride and self reliance. David's intention was to measure Israel's military strength, placing trust in numbers instead of the Lord. First Chronicle shows that David did the census right after defeating the Philistines, which may have made him feel proud of his own strength. That is why even Joab, David's general, warned him, saying, "Why does my lord the king want to do such a thing?" David himself knew it was a sin. That is why once the census was completed, David realized his error and confessed his sin. So, what made the census sinful? 1. It was pride and self reliance. 2. It disregarded God's instructions. So, the census was sinful not because counting people is wrong, but because David's heart was wrong. He acted without God's command, ignored divine instructions, and trusted in numbers instead of God's guidance. So, what are the lessons we learn from this story? 1. God did not force David to sin. God allowed circumstances to reveal David's pride, but David himself made the choice. Second, sin is about the heart, not just the action. Counting people is not wrong if done under God's guidance. The sin was David's pride and lack of trust in God. Third, God's sovereignty and human responsibility work together. God can use human actions, even sinful ones, to fulfill his purposes. Humans are accountable for their choices and motives. Fourth, it is a call to trust God, not numbers or human strength. David's story is a reminder to rely on God in all things, not on statistics or military might or human plans. Today, the modern church can easily fall into the same trap David fell. Planning and strategies are good, but when strategy replaces dependence on God, it becomes pride, just like David's census. For instance, using surveys to shape doctrine or worship based on popular opinion can be a sin. Depending on branding, marketing campaigns rather than prayer and the power of the word can be a sin. Obsessing over attendance numbers more than spiritual growth, turning the church into a consumer experience to impress people. These can lead to God's displeasure. So 2 Samuel chapter 24 verse 1 is not a story about God tempting David to sin. It is a story about pride, human responsibility, and divine authority. May this lesson encourage us to reflect on our own decisions, check our hearts for pride, and always put our trust in God, because He is our strength, not numbers, plans, or human strategies. If this explanation helped you, do not forget to like, comment, and share. If you come across a difficult verse, let me know in the comments. We will discuss them in the coming weeks. Also, if you have not subscribed to this channel, please subscribe and click the bell icon so that you will receive notifications for all new videos. Thank you for watching. We will see you in the next video.